Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're beginning to look at Matthew chapter 24. And this begins the last great teaching section in the book of Matthew. Now you will recall that early on in our study I told you that in Matthew's structure there are 5 great teaching units in this gospel. The first unit was chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. The second unit was chapter 10, which is Jesus sending his disciples on mission. The third unit was chapter 13, the parables of the kingdom, where Jesus, through parables, explained the nature of the kingdom of God. The fourth section was chapter 18, in which Jesus talks about life in the community of faith, or life in the church. And now the fifth section is chapters 24 and 25, in which Jesus talks about the end times, or the second coming. You also might recall that I told you that these 5 great units of teaching material correspond to the 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, or the books of the law, are the books of Moses. And so the very structure of Matthew has told us that Jesus comes to have a similar ministry to that of Moses. In other words, Moses was the one God used to establish the first covenant, the covenant at Mount Sinai. And Jesus has come as the Son of God to establish the second covenant, the new covenant, the covenant established by his blood shed on the cross of Calvary and affirmed by the resurrection. So Jesus is in many senses that second Moses, establishing the new covenant, the covenant of the Christian faith. So those are why we have the 5 sections of teaching material in the book of Matthew. As I said, this last section, chapters 24 and 25, deal with the last things, or the end times, or the second coming. So let's introduce them today, and we'll spend the next few days talking about what Jesus teaches us about the end times. Notice it says in verse 1 that Jesus was leaving the temple and was walking away. It was in the temple area, in the temple courtyards, where he'd been having that conflict with the Pharisees, where they had been asking him questions. He had asked them a question, and then he had pronounced those woes upon them. But now he is leaving the temple area, walking away, and his disciples come up to him, and they call his attention to all the buildings of the temple. Now, the temple was a magnificent structure. Herod the Great had built the temple we know in New Testament times. Now, Herod obviously didn't care about the temple as a place of worship. He was not a religious person, we know that. But Herod loved to build things. He loved great structures. He was a great builder. And one of the achievements of his lifetime was the building of the temple, which was a tremendous structure, one of the greatest in the world at that time. And so Jesus' disciples called his attention to the magnificence of the temple, the building. And Jesus says, "Do you see all these things, all this building of the temple? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Jesus tells them of a time when the temple will be destroyed, when every stone will be thrown down. Now that's going to occur about 40 years after Jesus speaks these words. This is the year AD 30 when this is happening. The temple will be destroyed in AD 70. The Romans will destroy it, and literally they will not leave one stone standing upon another. So Jesus is prophesying the destruction of the temple, which is going to come in exactly 1 generation after he speaks these words. Now the disciples are flabbergasted that Jesus would say such a thing. They cannot conceive of the temple being destroyed. And so they come to Jesus privately on the Mount of Olives and say, "Tell us, when will this happen, the destruction of the temple? When will it happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now see what the disciples are saying? They assume that if the temple is destroyed, that must be the end of the age. So they asked, when will the temple be destroyed and what will be the sign of the end? They assume they will be one and the same event. Now they're wrong. The destruction of the temple will not signal the end of the age. But since they've asked that question, Jesus uses the opportunity to begin to teach them about his second coming, about when the last times will begin and occur, and what will be the signs of the end of the age. So here we see Jesus and his disciples sitting on the Mount of Olives, talking first about the temple and its destruction, which is going to occur 40 years later, but also more importantly for us, Jesus talking to them about his second coming and how the world will reach its conclusion when the kingdom of God will be fully established. So for our next few days together in our 5-minute study, we're going to look very carefully at some of the things Jesus says to us about the second coming, about the end of the age, and what he tells us to do in preparation for that, and how our hearts ought to be looking toward that day, whenever it may come. So join us for our next few studies as we talk about Jesus' words on the second coming and the end of the age. I'll see you next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew.